Hello and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Marco Donnarumma, who is an artist, a performer, a stage director, and theorist who has been making incredible work in the spheres of contemporary performance, new media art, and interactive computer music for more than 20 years. Marco holds a PhD in performing arts, computing, and body theory from Goldsmiths. And among other places, he has worked as a researcher at the Academy for Theatre and Digitality in partnership with Theatre Dortmund and at Thor Magnusson's Intelligent Instrument Labs. His work has been seen and heard all over the world, and Marco has received numerous awards and accolades. Today, we shall be delving into his fascinating and bespoke creative process. We'll be hearing about some of the technical workings of his works. We'll be hearing about how he approaches the body as a corpus and also how he explores the body in the age of artificial intelligence. So, Marco, hello, and thank you so much for talking with me today.
Hi everyone. Glad to be here.
So perhaps you could begin by explaining how you got into the world of music and sound design, and also how you shifted towards body performance in the latter part of the 2000s.
Yeah, so like once upon a time. No, I'm kidding. Well, I started working with video art and sound arts back in 2004. That was my first approach to independently pursue an artistic voice. Before I was making raves and techno and drum and bass music and breakcore in my previous life. And then I just developed this passion for sound and how sound could interact with images or with other means, technological or known. And eventually, after a degree at the University of Fine Arts in Venice, in Italy, then I started working a bit around with some early performances until I landed in Scotland. And there was probably one of my most formative time. I did this master by research at the University of Edinburgh, ECA. And my supervisor there was Martin Parker, probably some listeners already know. Fantastic mentor and artist and musician. And there, as part of research in sound design, um, I found out about the sounds of muscles, and which sounds very weird and awkward, but if you think about the heartbeat is simply the sound of the muscle walls of the heart that contracts and expand. That's what the heartbeat is. And it turns out that there are sounds all over the body wherever a muscle is moving. And this was actually my link then to performance. I always been passionate about performance art, especially feminist performance from the 70s. And when I found out about muscle sounds and started envisioning this link between body and movement, so direct and so intimate, that opened up for me a whole new perspective. And so that's when I started delving into the relation of sound, body, and movement. And it was interesting because I did not have biological science background or biomechanics background, but there at the University of Edinburgh, I had the chance to do this as a self-taught and maybe taking other courses and so on. And that's where I gradually started forming myself in this weird nexus of disciplines.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to hear. I mean, just over this podcast and the artists that I meet from all over the world, how many people have been to Edinburgh, which really seemed like a big epicenter for this kind of field. Of course, Martin Parker was there present at the final FluCoMa concert, which was held at Edinburgh. Yeah. Yeah, so mentioning the sort of biosenses and things like that, which is going to be really important for your work. I'd love so we'll be getting into the kind of technical details of that in just a bit, but perhaps first, just to gain a sort of a good overview of your artistic approach. Perhaps you could give us a general overview of the role that the body takes on in your work from perhaps a conceptual point of view. What does the subject of the body or bodies afford for you as an artist?
Yeah, so mm, when people ask me what I do, I always start by saying I work with the body. And only after I mention technology and sound and so forth. If there was one word to mention all these things together, I would probably just say that. But I like to frame my practice from a perspective that is focused on the body because I like to explore how a performer, audience, and society at large understand the body when it enters into connection with other media or other creature or other people. And so I use the body as a musical instrument. I conceptualize the body also as a territory to explore and push to the edges. And what particularly interests me are those borders of the experience. So how far out or far in can you push a certain type of experience on your body as a performer in this case, but sometimes also with bodies of the audience, and what is there to learn? And of course, the body is never isolated. The body exists in various levels of networking elements. Even just my body is not just my body. I don't know how many millions other things living in it that make me as what I am. But then I also have my partner, my friends, my society, my audiences, people that I meet. And all of these, of course, creates incredibly complex relations that you can explore through sound and technology, because both are intimately connected to the body and to the making of a. And what I mean more practically, we were talking about sounds coming from the body and making music with it. So that's a very straightforward example. But this also sound emerges from anything that moves. So it's intrinsically related to life. Of course, there are also non-living things that make sound. That's also part of, but it's another topic. And so I find these elements incredibly fascinating. And technology, on the other hand, it's changing the body continuously so much that actually it's difficult to keep track of those changes. And especially today is the time we live in, everything is so fast, and there is so much information shared every second that I think it's difficult to keep track of how our understanding of a body and what it means to have one, to be one, is changing.
Yeah.
So that makes for a lot of artistic inspiration.
Yeah. It's a very rich place to be operating in. So yeah, as you say, the body is obviously a very important running theme in your work, and then there's the technological side of things, and perhaps more specifically, the idea of artificial intelligence, which comes up a lot in your work. So to sort of round off this introduction, I think perhaps be useful if you could talk about what artificial intelligence is for you, and what forms of artificial intelligence do you look to explore in your work?
Yeah, that's a deep question. So if I had to be very concise here, well, what is artificial intelligence for me? Two things, I guess. One is an unfortunate idiom to call a thing that is not really what it's named after. So artificial intelligence is a very weird term because it implies that the only natural intelligence is the human one, which is very stupid. Obviously, it's not. And second, artificial in respect to what? Some could say, okay, because it's man-made, then it's artificial. Okay, fine. But still, in respect to what? So I like to think of it more as computational intelligence. That's a lot more specific, in the same way as you could say ant intelligence or dog intelligence or whales intelligence. So there is, if I could agree that there is a certain degree of intelligence in computational machines. But I'm also very firm in stating that it is a very specific, peculiar kind of intelligence. And it's not really relatable that much to other types of intelligence that are not human-made. And well, now I've been using it since over 10 years. And in these past 10 years, a lot has happened. Um, Also, a disclaimer, I'm a programmer, but there are many programmers that are much better than me out there. So I also like to collaborate with them. And for example, the first person that I worked with on a project, including AI, which was my performance Corpus Nil, was Baptiste Caramio, great researcher, working also at edges of artificial intelligence, music, psychology. Um, and through him, I got my first introduction to machine learning. That's the way how we used to call it up to 4 or 5 years ago. And then I just kept being in the loop because, of course, on one hand, I'm being a nerd and an inventor. I'm very interested in what different languages can emerge from such a thing. On the other hand, I'm also very critical of the whole enterprise as it is manifested today. And what I try to do in a nutshell, it's really to abuse the tools that are out there and try to make them do things that are not supposed to do. Because for how complex and sophisticated an algorithm or a system can be, it's still based on deterministic machines. Without considering here quantum computing, that's a whole other conversation, but still. And so as an artist, what I spend most of my time trying to program things against their own determinism in order to find more interesting ways of using them, or alternative ways of designing interactive system, essentially.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, you've written some very interesting pieces on the ways that artificial intelligence manifests themselves in our society at large, which we'll perhaps return to more towards the end. To thinking of the big generative models like Midjourney and Dolly and that kind of stuff. Um, but I think first, I'm glad you mentioned that you call yourself a nerd in some sense, because I'd like to get into some of the nerdy technical details of your work, because I think that's a good way into really gaining a good understanding about your creative process. So I think a good place to begin would be to hear about the Xth Sense, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, which you developed back in 2010, which is I think it's fair to say the main technology that allows you to explore the what you were talking about earlier, the sounds of the body and things like that. So perhaps to begin, you could explain what it is, the roles that it may have played in different works, and I'd also be interested to hear if or and how it may have developed over the years from initial conception over perhaps different different versions.
Yeah, so the Xth is made of hardware and software. The hardware is something I designed, as you said, back in 2010, and it's a very simple bracelet which uh, is embedded with an electric condenser microphone. These are very common microphones that are used in phones, for example, but the particular ones I use have a very low frequency, have a frequency range that reach the lowest, supposedly lowest perception of sound, so around 20 hertz. But this allows them to be very sensitive also to what is beyond 20 hertz, because of course there is a curve there. It's not just capping at 20 hertz. This turns out to be very useful with muscle sounds, because muscle sounds exist between 1 hertz and 20 hertz, depending on different type of muscular contraction and how many muscle fascicles are activated at a given time and so on. And so essentially this microphone is powered by a tiny battery, and it captures vibrations from the skin, but without direct contact. And this vibration, then, when you do a contraction, there is always a vibration there. So muscles actually behave like rubber bands, if you want. So you stimulate them, they start vibrating until they stabilize in a normal everyday movement. And this means that you can capture sounds from any part of your body, which is pretty cool to use in performance. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities. Now, if you were just to amplify the sounds with this microphone, you would get a sound that it's inaudible. You could possibly break some buffer with something that you're not even hearing, because the amplitude in the very low frequency range, the amplitude of these sounds is massive. But this makes it in turn very handy for the filtering curve of the mic itself. So you can still capture very good signals. And the signal, which is called mechanomyogram, is very cool and dynamic, but also quite difficult and fuzzy to work with. And it is basically the twin of the electromyogram, which is much better known because it is used in prosthesis, for example. The mechanomyogram, which is the acoustic sound, so the vibration, that's what I use, is a little less used, but that's also where it comes from prosthesis, also from rehabilitation. Sometimes it's used to detect involuntary tremors, for example, or things like that, and also for prosthesis control. Um, I never understood why the mechanomyogram is not so widespread as the electromyogram, because when you compare the two, they are actually complementary. I also did some study with Baptiste too, and we published some research about that. But the electromyogram is a lot more expensive to set up compared to the mechanomyogram. So I wonder what kind of market dynamic is behind there. But anyway, and then I have a software. My software is written in Pure Data, which is my main software for anything. And within that software, I have, through the years, developed this system for conditioning the signal first, then throw it in a workspace where you can manipulate it for DSP, and also I set up a set of feature extractions. Some are also co-developed with Baptiste. And basically what happens is a bit like when you plug a guitar, the guitar is your body, the pedal is the Xth Sense. So you produce sounds with your body, you can manipulate those sounds, but you can also control how you manipulate those sounds by mapping features of the same muscle activity onto the DSP. And you can, of course, also use this as a MIDI controller if you like, although I find it that quite constraining for all the possibilities that it has. And I guess at this point you can imagine like there is an infinite amount of things that you can do with this instrument. Then also I call it a musical instrument and not a sensor, because the combination of hardware and software is very important. If you just get the signal out of the sensor, you can't really do much. So the software is what makes the hardware a proper musical instrument.
Mm. Well, it's interesting because yeah, many approaches that I've seen do work with sensors on the body, and it's you're dealing more with a kind of sonification of data that's been picked up. Whereas here, I mean, so obviously you talked about having to condition the signal in certain ways, but we are kind of having, so it's not a straight amplification of the body, but we're drawing acoustic material from the body and somewhat treating it as a corpus, as a acoustic corpus, which obviously, you know, the meaning of that term in French and Italian and things, the corps as body, is obviously particularly pertinent to your work. But for me, it's really interesting how the Xth Sense offers this a corpus that not only is acoustically interesting, but it's also inextricably linked to the gesture and the movement. So the acoustic material can't be extracted from the physicality of it as well. So you talked about feature extraction and some conditioning, but I was just wondering what sort of technical strategies do you put in place for exploring this corpus? What kind of features will you look to draw from that signal? How would you describe this signal from an acoustic but also a gestural point of view? How do you analyze it and manipulate it?
Yeah, so there are different levels, and these have changed also through the years. Now it's actually some time that I don't update it anymore. I just keep using it as it is, but we probably talk about it later. I'm connecting it to other toolkits. But essentially, well, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that there is always a sound coming from the body. So if you were to just open up the gate, you would just hear continuous sounds that sometimes make sense, some other not. You would also get the sounds of the blood flowing in your veins. You would get sounds from bones crackling and anything. So you need, first of all, to understand what kind of sound are you interested in, where that sound is living in the frequency range that you capture, and then isolate that sound. You can do that with common filters. That's not rocket science. And then also using thresholding system to let the sound out only when it clearly relates to the movement that you're working with. Otherwise, you would have always sound. So these are the basics. And then for feature extraction, so the first feature extraction that I designed when I was still in Edinburgh were pretty empirical and were various collection of RMS and thresholding and smoothing algorithms. What I try to do with those, and I still use them today, was to kind of capture certain aspects of muscular activity that would be specifically useful for mapping techniques to the SPE. So these do not make much sense from a biomechanics point of view, for example. They do not exist there. In this sense, they are empirical features that I set up by testing and iterating, testing over and over until I saw that something would work better. So it was all about having features that would represent the muscular activity at a higher level, if you want, but in very different ways, still connected to the movement. So there are some features which are really super reactive, others that are so smooth that they are just much slower. There are features that also happens on a big chunk of time, for example, so that you can map also that kind of longer time interaction onto the system. And then later on, when I was doing my PhD at Goldsmiths, and that's where I met Baptiste, there I started working more systematically with biomechanics literature. And this was very tricky because I was doing my PhD, in between HCI and computer music and performance and feminist studies and disability studies, like a whole transdisciplinary Pandora's box that I put together. And so I had to go through a lot of feature extraction methods that were the best for HCI, but completely useless for music performance. And eventually, I set up on three features that are very low-level features of the mechanomyogram, and have to do with measure of effort that you can infer from the signal, effort over time. Also, the power centroid of the signal, which, well, for those who don't know, it can be roughly described as the highest level of magnitude from each frequency being. So you can follow that, and interestingly, that piece of data can allow you to infer the complexity of muscle contraction. So where this is a very simple contraction, and a torsion like that, it's a lot more complex complex and simple in relation to how many muscle are you activating, basically. And then also how much, like the recovery time of muscle groups. And so putting these together, these three features together with the higher level features, then you get a very nice view of muscular activity of a performer in real time. Then sometimes I also use direct FFT on the signal, which is pretty cool to use too for different kind of experiments and interactions. And now I got so much into the nerd parts that I forgot the other part of the question.
No, well, that was the kind of nerdy talk that I was hoping to hear. But yeah, no, so that's really interesting. So you converging around those three very specific to this kind of use case features of effort, of complexity of muscle contraction, recovery time of muscle groups. It's really interesting. Perhaps perhaps it would be useful if we could take an example of a piece where you use the Xth Sense and generally develop this idea of biophysical music. So, I mean, we could talk about a number of different pieces, but perhaps a good example is Corpus Nil, which you mentioned earlier from 2016. So the piece develops the idea of biophysical music and emerges from a feedback loop between performer and machine. And as well as sound, there's also lighting that's adaptive and or reactive, and obviously the very striking visual aspect of the piece is very important. So perhaps you could talk about maybe not all of the piece, but specifically how some examples of how you take these different features and this audio signal that you get from the Xth Sense and how it manifests itself throughout this kind of piece, and perhaps also talk about how this kind of symbiotic human machine system allows you to explore ideas of the human body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Corpus Nil is a good example. So there, okay, at the musical and interaction level, we could say there are two macro areas, so to say. On one hand, a large part of that music is created in real time by the machine learning system that I created. It's using some physical modeling to imitate the magnitude of different frequency beams coming from the mechanomyogram. So basically, you get the signal from the muscle, you analyze that signal in real time, look at magnitude of frequency beams, and then you got this mapping with machine learning that uses a bank of synthesizers to reproduce that sound. And that's on one hand. Then on the other hand, there is the actual responsive and interactive part of the system, which is based on those feature extraction technique that I mentioned earlier, which allowed me to map those features onto that other part of the system. So this allows this two ways interaction that on one hand I have some mapping, so I have some degree of control, but not an entire control over what's happening musically. And on the other hand, you have this thing that just sounds like it just sounds, and you cannot avoid it from sounding. You cannot stop it from sounding. So in that piece, I was very interested in, well, something that then became quite central to all my practice, which is really how can you, as I said before, go against the determinism of these machines and connecting them with the body. It's very useful in this sense. Of course, this also goes insert into itself into a whole tradition of improvising with machines. That it's wonderful tradition that we have in our field. But this take the physicality and the physiological activity of the body as a centerpiece of the attitude to the work. That's also why I call this stuff biophysical music. This is also to differentiate it from biomusic, which is another established field of music that is done with physiological signal, but most of the time it has to do with signal that can be captured only when the body is fairly still. So you can think EEG or other microvoltages taken from the skin for different reason or other kind of data like that. And this was a very strong movement back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And that's where I took inspiration from, but I wasn't really convinced about the need of staying still. I felt like so much potential was not being used there. And that's where all this idea came from. That's where the name comes from as well. So it's biophysical music, because without markedly physical effort, you cannot make this stuff. And that's what really interests me, because then you can create this connection, as in Corpus Nil, between the real physical effort of the performance and different ways of analyzing it, or the performer, sorry, and different way of analyzing it, and these interactive systems running on a computer. And these, from the point of view of the performance and of the performer, and perhaps also from the point of view of the audience, I think creates a quite unconventional way of experiencing the performance itself, because it's pretty, when you see the performance live, it's pretty clear that something is happening right there in front of you, and also that I'm not really able to control everything. And that's the most exciting part about it, because then it makes you think, you audience, me performer, okay, what should I do next? Oh my God, what's this sound coming up now? Maybe I can change it a bit, and I'll do something trying to change it, to modulate it. But for example, when the system goes silent because maybe it took me a long time to recover from a certain position, then I cannot just trigger a button and say restart. I just have to keep moving until the thing decides it's a good moment to start making sounds again. Yeah.
Mm. Well, I mean, I haven't had the pleasure of seeing the piece live, but even from recordings, yeah, it seemed to be teeming with energy and a really, really intriguing piece. And yeah, because I mean, obviously the types of sounds are well up my street, but also, yeah, the connections between the visual side of things and the energy that it seems to be creating are really, really, really interesting. Um, Before we sort of move on from the Xth Sense specifically, there was one thing I wanted to talk about as well, which I think will resonate with a few of many of the listeners that will be listening to the podcast. So it appears to have been very important for you to have made it open source and widely available, because so not only is the software available online, but also the schematics and very comprehensively well-written documentation, including beginner-friendly tutorials and things like that. So I wonder if you could perhaps talk about the process of taking an experimental object like that you've developed in your artistic practice and presenting it to the world. Were there challenges you had to overcome? And how do you position the technical and development side of your artistic work in regard to things like open source software and sharing software?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I will start from the second part of the question. It's a very interesting tension. Now, I think that there is only to be something to be earned when someone can share an instrument or the way how to make it, because then it's up to you what you use the instrument for. And maybe I'm also a bit protected because I do very weird stuff that I don't think most people would like even to do. So that kind of protects me a little bit. But then, I'm not sharing my own patches, for example. I don't think I should. That's so the way I program the system, that's part of my artistic voice. And sharing the tool that I use for it, it's actually pretty cool. And I've been working with open source since ever. I work on Linux and everything that comes with it only since decades. And I owe a lot to the open source community in general. And so, yeah, the minimum I can do is to give something back there. I have to admit that some years ago well, I had much more time to handle the process of maintaining open source software and hardware. I was much more involved in it, mostly because of a question of time, which I don't have anymore these days. And I think also it was kind of a different time. Um, it was yeah, I think so. 2012, I won the Gatman instrument competition, and that got to the project a lot of visibility. And that was also the time of the frenzy of the Kickstarter campaigns, where there was all these gadgets everywhere, all the time, every day something new. But in general, I think culturally, there was a lot more interest in experimenting with unconventional stuff for a variety of reasons. And I don't think it was due to Kickstarter. I think Kickstarter was following a cultural trend, actually, which now that I say it, it's an interesting comparison to today where the contrary is happening, right? We are all submerged by these conformist tools. They are all the same. Not in our field of research in music, in experimental music, of course, but imagine talking about generate image generator and stuff like that. Anyway, that's a tangent. So I really enjoyed for several years to do that kind of work. I was also giving a ridiculous amount of workshop where we would build a sensor from scratch and study the software and make tiny prototypes of stuff. And that was really fun. I mean, I learned a lot also from the people that I talked to, and still today I just every once in a while I still meet people. Oh, I took your Xth Sense workshop like 12 years ago. Oh, really? Nice. What are you doing now? And then the point is not that I want an army of people that use that instrument, because of course most people is just interested in experimenting and they will go off onto something else. But I think the main point is the beauty of being able to share some knowledge with other people. Then they can use it or not. It's up to them. But that knowledge is there, and it's open, and it shows that anybody can do it. And I know this sounds a bit naive, but I think it's still very important today. All the do-it-yourself culture, or the more recent do it with others as well. All that stuff that has been submerged by this terrible hyper-capitalism that we are living in. So it was a good time back then. And then now everything is still available. Actually, I was always fustigate myself that I still didn't move it to GitHub where it should be. But I will take some time to do that soon. And then, yeah, something fun is also that I always wanted to do it wireless. but it's a lot more complicated than it sounds, even today. And so that's still my dream in a drawer. But at the same time, I grow so accustomed to using cables that they became an aesthetic important part of my practice. And those who know my work can very well see how many cables I have now all the time. That's also interesting. It's not something that I planned in advance, but also now I don't even see a reason why I should get rid of the cables because of what they mean, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm always fascinated in hearing how technological constraints have, I mean, are always having an impact on the work that people create with them, and yeah, the agency that the tools that we use can have, and yeah, it's really interesting to hear about that how the cables could enter into your aesthetic, and yeah, um, great, yeah, I'll move on. Now to another subject that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the kind of umbrella and perhaps clumsy term of artificial intelligence, but perhaps more specifically neural networks and things like that. So again, I think it could be useful to approach this with a piece, with one of your pieces, to sort of hear about how you've used neural networks and things in your actual artistic process. So one piece that I was particularly struck by was Amygdala from 2018, from your seven configuration cycle. So just to sort of very quickly explain to the people who haven't wouldn't have seen it yet. So it's a piece that proposes an artificially intelligent robot in the form of a human-like limb, which is progressively learning a skin cutting ritual on this. So it's kind of suspended like this on an old repurposed computer farm. So yeah, yeah, and it's scratching and cutting into this suspended sheet of artificial, but very kind of uncannily lifelike skin. And it's visually very, very striking. But yeah, there's loads of really interesting things happening technically. I wonder if you could describe to us sort of globally what's happening under the hood, and then maybe we could get into the more kind of neural network side of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the robot uses a framework that's called behavior design environment made by the scientific partner that I work with, which is the Neurorobotics Research Lab here. And that's a very powerful piece of almost firmware. It's not even software, but it's written in Fort. Fort is a sort of ancient programming language, one of the earliest. Today is mostly used for space technology or stuff like that. Because on one hand, like nobody would want to code with that today. It's like really, you don't want to do it. On the other hand, there are very little more efficient programming language than that, especially when it comes to robotics. Now, one of the main one of the main topic in robotics is, especially within AI robotics, is the latency of the response of the robot. So, a robot is basically a machine with some sensors that can sense the environment and possibly sense its own body too. And then with this information, it triggers cascades of activities in an artificial sensory motor system. So you sense something and in action, and a situation is described, an action is predicted, and then you do the action. That's how all animals work, and AI robotics in many different ways and with many different techniques attempts to achieve this. Now, the work of the Neurorobotics Lab is very interesting because they have been doing for a couple of decades fascinating work with biomimetic algorithms. And so my work with Amygdala was done in using their platform. And so I programmed from scratch these robots using biomimetic algorithms and some other basic machine learning stuff. But you have really to program it from scratch, from nothing. And there are no libraries, there is no TensorFlow that you can use because you're writing code on an SD card for an FPGA. So it took me 1.5 years in crash courses with the lab there to learn what I needed to learn. But then eventually it was mind-blowing. So coming back to the problem of latency, most of the off-the-shelf robots that you can buy and build or stuff like that, they run through an operating system. They are specialized operating system, so there is little latency, but you still have latency. And that's why if you observe a robot interacting truly by itself, so not something that is teleoperated like most of the videos that are online, you will see that there is always some seconds latency because that's the amount of time it takes. Because there is an operating system most of the time. And so you have all these background tasks like in any computer, really. You just slow down your main activity, your main task. So the fact of working on an FPGA, which is designed by the lab to work only with robotics, that you can program this thing without any latency. And that's what gives Amygdala that uncanny feeling, because it really feels alive. There is like zero latency in what it senses and what it does. Then, well, another there are 6 motors, different, and I program a very basic neural network for each of the motors, and then I connected those neural networks with one another so that they are aware of their own position, how much power they're receiving, but also of the positions and the power of the others. So when you multiply 1 by 6, you get this infinite combination of position and whatnot. And then there is a very simple linear regression method that I use to detect different kind of postures, and especially most of my programming skills went in programming the machine so that it wouldn't get stuck on itself, which is always funny because you see always these complicated robots and stuff, but then what really takes time is to enable them to do the most basic stuff. That's yeah. So what it's really fascinating is that in this way, I never programmed any predetermined movement for these machines, but just programmed their artificial sensory motor system. And then they have this neural network that generates movements by themselves. They are kind of oscillators, essentially, which is an established technique in robotics, in some robotics. And so you get these machines that really act on the base of its own sensing and nothing else, at a very basic level, but it does so. And that is fascinating because then you can observe the machine moving for hours. It will just never repeat the same thing ever. And yeah, also because I have another little algorithm for curiosity, so that kind of change weights of the neural network after a while that it sees the oscillation, it is more or less repeating itself, something like that.
Hmm. That's fascinating, and yeah, it does render this very uncanny and intriguing results and movements. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. You mentioned that so you worked with a number of people on this piece, and it's interesting to hear that I mean, despite a collaboration, you still looked to work to train yourself for a year and a half on specific techniques to be able to do things in your work. But so I'm interested to hear about your approach to collaborative work, and because especially in the more kind of theatrical turn that your work has taken, you seem to be working with bigger and bigger teams on different pieces. I'm interested to hear about how the collaborative work compares to your solo stuff, and what kind of configurations and postures do you look to adopt? Because yeah, I think it's not necessarily every artist would have spent a year and a half training themselves to be able to do this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, being a nerd, I just like to make things and break them and remake them. So I fabricated the robots myself. I even made the cables because I want to have my cables for this thing, and because I couldn't find the necessary cables as I wanted them. So, um, I have the privilege of making a life as an artist, so I can spend my time when I have it to learn stuff. And it was really formative for me to learn about how to construct robots, how to engineer them, what is the morphology of a robot, how you conceive it, how you program a robot, what do you need for it, all the hardware that comes with it, and so forth. It's a whole universe that it's super fascinating. At the same time, I'm not doing a PhD in robotics. So that's a big difference. You can spend a lot of time as an artist exploring a certain field, and then I like to take what I need from that field. I like to go very deep into it, but also to stay very focused. No? Then, in terms of collaboration, there are some things that I like to do with others because maybe they have a better expertise, or because of delegating tasks to a professional is always better, especially at a certain level when you hardly have time to do any art at all. And I try to delegate things that that do not necessarily needs to be entirely made by myself. And I like that because then you can take in the expertise and creativity of someone else. So, for example, visual design, so the visual appearance of the robots and the prostheses, I often collaborate with other people. Um, it's always a difficult balance between establishing a teamwork that work under your artistic direction while still giving enough creative space to everybody. It's an interesting and challenging question, but I also do think that some of the best work have emerged from this kind of approach. And Mm, coming to more theatrical performances, then that's the fact of collaborating with others becomes almost a necessity. And again, collaborating, you can collaborate in many different ways. You can be an artistic director that have collaborators that help support and develop a specific vision. So everybody work independently, but they do eventually support your own vision. Or you can also collaborate from scratch at the same level. Um, at the same artistic level. I tend to go more often for the first because I tend to have very specific visions of what I want an artwork to be. But sometimes I can also do it the other way around. In theater, maybe I could be a performer for another artistic director, for example. I don't do it often, but sometimes that's also cool. And I guess it really depends on the kind of artistic needs and artistic ideas one has. Then, of course, when you start working in theater, then you have to work with people that have very specific expertises. A theater is a huge machine, and it would be impossible as a single artist to interface with a theater, like very hard. Uh, and also, I would like also to mention the importance of collaborators that are not artistic collaborators, but for example, producers, studio managers. It would be impossible to do what I do at this level without my studio manager and producer. So big thanks to her. And those are also very important collaboration, because sometimes when people talk about collaboration in artistic field, you just imagine these artists drinking wine and doing their things, but actually there is a lot of collaboration that goes on behind the scenes in order to produce and realize, or even just set the ground for something, find fundings. All of this stuff would not exist without application and fundings. And that also requires collaboration to some extent. Yeah. And the difference between my solo stuff and the other collaborative works, well, again, I think an artist needs to follow what the artwork needs. I'm more on that school of thought. At some point, your artwork will try to tell you something, and that is the very important moment. That's when if you can grasp that, what the artwork is asking you, then you're probably gonna do something amazing. And if you don't, then their troubles can begin. And spent, yeah, maybe now it's about half of my career doing solo stuff, and that was incredibly formative. And then I spent almost as many years in doing more collaborative and transdisciplinary work. And now I'm actually back into doing solo stuff, with the difference that my solo stuff from many years ago were maybe 20 minutes. And now the latest piece I made is Excellence. It's 1 hour and 15. And doing a solo performance of 1 hour and 15, it's like a great achievement. I'm actually quite proud. But you need a certain experience and a certain understanding and to do that. So this is to say, I think it's good to have a process that brings you around different morphologies of collaborations, and then you should feel free to then do what the artistic vision requires from you.
Yeah. Well, well, we could possibly getting on to some of your more recent work, because I wanted to ask you about because I know that you've been using some of the FluCoMa tools recently. And I know specifically you've been working with the fluid plotter object, so sort of projecting sounds into embedding spaces and things like that. I wonder, if you could talk about what drew you to that kind of interface for corpus exploration, and how you've been approaching some of the toolkit.
Yeah, that's another long story. I will try to keep it short. The premise is I'm a late deafened person, so I have hearing aids that, together with my little residual hearing, allow me to talk with you and look like a hearing person, but I'm not a hearing person, actually quite deaf. And this since about 10 years or so. And it took me about 10 years to understand how I wanted to work with deafness and about deafness. I always wanted to, but I always felt a bit awkward being in this position of growing up as a hearing person, so with a lot of privileges in respect to a deaf person who was deaf from birth. And then finding myself now as a disabled artist, as I identify now, and that is an ongoing shift. So this new piece that I mentioned is actually part of a larger project about deafness, sound, and AI and prosthesis. And it emerges from several months of participatory research with a group of fellow deaf people, where we basically shared our experiences of sound, which may sound a bit counterintuitive until you start thinking about deafness as another mode of perception. Because we are used to think of sound and the experience of sound as hearing, which basically means cochlear hearing. But anybody working with sound and music knows that sound is actually a lot more than what we get through our cochlea. So in this sense, if you start thinking in that direction, you can at some point imagine deafness as another mode of perception, also because deafness does not mean necessarily that you either hear or don't hear. There are an infinite combination of conditions and hearing skills or perception of sound skills. So I set up to then use what we learned from the group through sound libraries and stuff like that to create two artworks. So one is a short film entitled Nirantea, that's currently touring festivals. And the other is Excellence, the performance that I mentioned earlier and that you asked about. The reason why I'm saying this, because it's the important premise to understand the kind of work I've been doing there. So here I'm still working with prosthesis, but in contrast with the 7 configuration cycles where I was interested in these limb prosthetics, here I was not interested in a particular type of prosthetic per se, but I wanted to turn upside down the common meaning of prosthesis, taking up what we learned from the experience of sound by this deaf group of people, including myself, but it's not really biographical work. And so eventually what emerged is a set of prostheses that the hardware are made of acoustic transducers, and the software is this Frankenstein combination of FluCoMa tools and then other two toolkits libraries made by the Intelligent Instruments Lab in Iceland that are partners on this project. And the tools are called Tolvera and Anguilla. And so on one end, this prosthesis, hardware-wise, is very simple, but I designed it in a way that it's modular. It can be attached to my body, but I also use it on the body of the audience. Then I also attach it to surfaces and in different configurations, so I can use them as an external musical instrument using feedback techniques and stuff like that. And of course, the most interesting part then it's happening at the level of the software. So putting together my Xth Sense and the other 3 tools that I explained, Eventually, these prostheses can, for example, pick up sounds from my body or my heartbeat and transmit it physically, haptically onto the body of somebody else, or inside the body of somebody else. I can take the same sound of a body of an audience member and send it to another body, or at other points in the performance, these prostheses have their own sound generation on, which is also reactive to my physiological activity through the Xth Sense. So we can establish a dialogue, but they are also they have their own agency. And this is done with FluCoMa. So there I use different tools to create a data set in 2 dimension. Of different kind of sounds, and then I use Tolvera, which is an artificial life software, to navigate the data set. And Tolvera is also responsive to my physiological activity. So you create this very complex network of interaction and various computational agencies, and it's very fun to play. It's incredible fun to play. Now, maybe I would suggest our listener here and viewers maybe have a break and go look at these prostheses, how they look on the body and on stage, to understand a bit better, because it may sound a bit abstract until you see them. But yeah, the whole point here was to redefine what a prosthesis is, and in particular to say, like, look, we always thought about prosthesis as something individual, but a prosthesis is never like that. It's always communal or a social thing, eventually, apart from being individual, obviously. But you can also have prostheses that are designed to be communal, such as these. So I really like the idea of having prostheses that could not only manipulate my body, but manipulate the body of the audience member as well. So engaging them directly in the performance, not as witness, but as resonating bodies themselves. Then in the performance, there are also a lot of other stuff happening. Now I'm focusing on this just for the sake of clarity. But of course, non-cochlear sound is very important. So there is a ridiculous amount of subwoofers. The composition, it's also made primarily for deaf people and then for hearing people. But the composition is also, the interactive composition happens in 2 sometimes converge and some other times diverge. So I try to create a performance that can be experienced by both deaf and hearing people, albeit in different ways, obviously. And it was quite fun. I have a special place for FluCoMa in my little heart of a programmer, especially for all the effort that has been put in creating the documentation for Pure Data. I really appreciate that. Using Pure Data since 20 years, it's not very common to see somebody who comes from another kind of software environment spending so much time into making that happen. So that was really great. And I also like the modularity of it, which goes very well with the modularity of the other tools by the Intelligent Instruments Lab. I think this is one of the most exciting things that I see now. So like forgetting about all the bullshit of corporation tools that are being delivered these days, but what the stuff that's happening now in research lab, I see this tendency toward modularity, and it's extremely cool because it really allows you to get very complex components and put them together to do ever complex systems. And now I don't want to sound like one who says the more complex, the better. That's not really the point, but I like complexity because of what we were talking about before. Complexity is a very good means of resistance against determinism. So that's why it's interesting.
Mm. No, that sounds really fascinating. Yeah, no, I'm really pleased to hear how FluCoMa has helped you in that project. And yeah, no, I was curious to hear about how Tolver. So just a quick shout out to Thor Magnusson, who was on the podcast maybe a year and a half ago, who was the PI on the Intelligent Instruments Lab, I think. I think at that time it was just beginning, I think. But it's yeah, no, it's really great to hear how that project's come on, how it's being used by artists, and yeah, I was really curious to hear how you were using the Tolvera artificial life algorithms. And so yeah, using that to explore a kind of embedding space. And yeah, that sounds really fascinating project. Yeah, cool. Uh, so we're more or less coming up on time. I had a few broader questions to ask you, but perhaps I'll just choose one. Um, One thing, yeah, that you've mentioned a few times, but we've kind of been skirting around, is something that was the subject of a paper you wrote in 2022, that was called Against the Norm, Othering and Otherness in AI Aesthetics. So in that paper, you developed the idea of corporate AI aesthetics, which, and grossly summarizing here, but is manifested in the form of corporate deep learning models like Midjourney and DALL-E and ChatGPT and things like that, and is ingrained in the very troubling idea that human creativity can be predicted, and therefore controlled, as you say in the paper. So yeah, perhaps to finish, even though it may be a somewhat pessimistic note to finish on, but I wonder if you could talk a bit more about this idea, and also this idea of prediction, and how that manifests itself in your work.
Hmm. Yeah, so well, I'm gonna take this chance to make my own shout out. Well, you already did it for Thor. I will make it to Jack Armitage and Victor Shepardson, who are the developers and also artists themselves, but the developers of Tolvera and Anguilla, because the conversation with them and with Thor as well, and also with Jonathan Reus, another great artist, have really informed a lot this paper we're talking about and these ideas. So I spent quite some time in Iceland with the team there. And it was interesting because I was on one hand working on the performance, the prosthesis that we just mentioned before, and on the other hand writing about this stuff. And the cool thing of being in partnership with them is that I've been not only the first adopter or maybe early adopter of all the things that we're making, but also, they are open enough to take in also comments and maybe not even feature requests, but more really thinking together about what kind of tools do we need. And from those ideas, I started uh, elaborating a bit better my critique of this corporate AI aesthetic, as I call it, because that in particular has been bothering me since a very long time. Now it's yeah, I think it's since 2012 or so that Google and Facebook and blah blah blah, Nvidia are pushing this stuff. So it's been a long time, and it's always hard to grasp it because, mm, of course, at a technological level, those are pretty massive achievements. So also in the paper, it's not that I try to deny the technological achievement of this thing. It's what I try to critique is the assumption, as you said correctly, that one can gather data about creativity just by scraping the internet and then predict what a creative behavior would be or a creative output would be. And this is just like plainly stupid. Like you just can't do that. Yeah, you can scrape the internet, of course, but that doesn't really tell you much about creativity. Well, maybe just to make one point, because then the paper is quite long, but just to make one point, the way I frame it in a more positive note is, so if we were really to think about creativity in relation to AI and generations of data sets and stuff like that, the two are not exclusive. It's not that the only way of doing it is to use Midjourney or code DALL-E as it is or ChatGPT as it is. That's not the only way. That's the way the corporate do it. And of course, they are corporates. Their main interest and first foremost interest is making money. That's what they are there for. Otherwise, nobody will be working there. There are other ways to think about creativity and artificial intelligence that understand creativity as something intrinsically tied to people, cultural context, local territory, histories, just to name a few factors. And that is creativity. It's not how many pixels are blue in 1 billion images of cats. That's not really creativity. Then, of course, there is also the tricky part that all of these deep learning technologies or statistical machine learning, it really comes on the back of statistics of the assumption of statistics on everything. And statistics is a beautiful field. It's an amazing field, but sometimes I feel like it's being misappropriated by the corporates who are developing this kind of AIs, because they take some assumption from statistic and then put it in the context of creativity. And it's like that jump is completely gratuitous and unfounded. It's just something they do because they can. And this is also, if you read their papers, especially the founding papers of diffusion models or transformers, like all that kind of stuff, and you realize that what these developers are doing, probably with the best intention of the world, but it's really just try to take creativity and stick it in their box. And from those papers, there isn't really an understanding of creativity at large that emerge, but just people thinking they can predict anything and put numbers on it. And yes, to some extent you can. But then we all see what you end up with, ocean of images that are all the same, essentially, and it's stuff that you can very well, even just after 1 year or so, recognize immediately. You see it, that it's done by the AI. Maybe you're not sure, but you get that feeling. So eventually, what are we doing all of this for? To just have the internet inundated by other billions of images that look all the same, that will be scraped the next year for the same models. So they will just feed themselves to themselves. So instead, if we want to close on a positive note, again, a research lab like the ones that we and some of our viewers, listeners would happen to work with, or individual initiatives and creativity taken at a local and situated level. That can be networked across the whole world. That's not a problem. But an idea of creativity that is based on experience, on lived experience of people that are developing this stuff, that are using this stuff. That's that's a good territory to navigate. That's where the more interesting stuff will come from. Um, and therefore I'm super happy that the kind of research, especially in music and interactive music, it's still alive and kicking. There are so many tools out there that one can use, and I think that's what the most exciting stuff will be coming from.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Marco. That was really, really interesting. Really enjoyed that chat. And hopefully, yeah, I think that was a positive enough note to leave people on. So I'll just remind people that so this YouTube is available. This podcast is available on YouTube and on various audio streaming platforms. However, if people look in the description of that, then they will doubtlessly find a link that will lead them to a page on the FluCoMa Learn platform where there will be links to everything that Mark and I have been discussing today. So be sure to check that out so that you can find links to all the various things. So Marco, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. It was a pleasure having you on. And yeah, I shall speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much. My
Uh,
pleasure here. Bye.